Okay, now it's my honor and a great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker of the morning, Don Chen, who is president of the Surdna Foundation. He joined the Surdna Foundation as its president in 2018, and that was after his tenure as director of Ford Foundation Cities and State Program. And in his current role, he leads Surdna's 100-year-old mission to deepen and leverage its commitment to social justice. He has served on many boards, including those for the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities, West Harlem Environmental Action, and the Environmental Leadership Program, and of course, everything is in the kit for detail. So please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Don Chen.
Good morning, everyone. How are you all doing? Great. Thank you, Claire, and I want to thank the Better Business Bureau of Metropolitan New York for inviting me to come and speak. I'm really glad we're talking about culture shift and new realities, because even in my 12 short years working in philanthropy, change has been a constant theme. We've had to really adapt, and adaptation, the ability to do so, is an imperative in the work that I do. And it's an imperative not just to survive, but also to lead with impact. And that's a lesson that I've really picked up along the way in my time in this sector. At Surdna Foundation, this theme of change is really important because we've been around for 100 years. Our story has a lot of examples of culture shift change because we've basically seen it all. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to share some of those lessons with you about those changes, the ways in which we've pursued culture shift, and like to shed some light on how that's affected our work and what might be valuable lessons for all of you working in the sector today. So I'll begin my remarks with a little bit of historical background, and what's striking to me, I've worked with the Surdna Foundation for getting close to 3 decades. I was a grant seeker. I was a grantee of the foundation back in the 90s. And what I've learned about the foundation is that its changes have really been very evolutionary, not really drastic, just gradual change building on, logical work from one phase to another. And over the course of 100 years, that has amounted to some significant differences compared to how the foundation began. But at the same time, there are some significant consistencies. So I'll talk about that gradual evolution. Then I'm going to talk about our current approach to philanthropy and social change. Prominent in that is our board of directors' recent decision back in the fall of 2018 to really center racial equity within our social justice mission. And then I'll conclude by sharing some of those lessons that I mentioned earlier about what we've learned along the way. So I'll start by talking about our founder, John Emery Andrus. He was born in 1841 in Pleasantville, New York. He was an enormously successful businessman. Later, he served as the mayor of Yonkers, and he served in Congress as well. So he had several different careers. Since this talk is being sponsored by the Better Business Bureau, I should note that he was often described as a highly ethical businessman. There was a profile of him in the New York Tribune in 1901 that described him as, quote, a model of what an employer should be, unquote, because he provided paid sick leave, which these days is really important because of the coronavirus. You want people to be able to have paid sick leave when they get sick. But he did that in 1901 before that was even heard of. That was very uncommon practice. He paid for holidays for his employees, and his factories never experienced a strike as of 1901 at the time of that profile, during a time in U.S. history that was characterized by bitter labor conflict. And even though he was really well known for his wealth, he became a bit of a celebrity because he was said to be one of the wealthiest men in the world at the time when he was at his peak in terms of wealth. And he was very well known for his political career. The thing that he cared about the most, and he said this in many speeches throughout his career. The thing he cared about the most was his values and his sense of morality, and that was grounded in his faith. He was a leader in the Methodist Episcopal Church. His father was a minister in that church, and he ended up being one of the largest donors to the church and paid for many things. He served on the finance committee for the church in the United States. And so in addition to his leadership roles in the church, his philanthropy was really his way of expressing his values and his intent and his interests. So in 1917, I have verbal mix-up here. But in 1917, he established the Surdna Foundation, and Surdna is Andrus spelled backwards, for reasons I'll get into in a moment. And the first thing he did was establish a large orphanage in Yonkers, which today is the Andrus Children's Center, right there on Broadway, if you all are familiar with that area. And he considered, and many people at the time considered, orphanages to be one of the most effective ways to really help some society's most marginalized people, help them live in dignity and then also climb out of poverty. In the decades since, Surdna's grant making has continued to be charitable up until about the 1980s. It was really focused on direct services, assistance to the less fortunate up until the 1980s. And then in the 80s, the board of the Surdna Foundation, which really consisted of all family members, decided that the foundation really needed to have a clearer mission, needed to have grant-making guidelines that could be shared with the public, and also needed to focus on social change, on strategic philanthropy. And for those of you who are in the sector, you know strategic philanthropy was a notion, a buzzword, a phrase that was developed with business ideas in mind. Michael Porter from Harvard Business School came up with it as a way to think about how foundations can really use their resources and their positioning, their wealth, et cetera, to try to advance specific societal goals. And Surdna was right there at the beginning of that, even before the term became popularized. But the family members and the board at the time recognized that it wasn't enough. It didn't feel like they were making enough of a difference just providing money for direct services, even though that's hugely important. They wanted to try to address the reformation of policies and practices and systems that create differences in opportunity and to produce better outcomes in our society. And they decided to focus nationally as well. So that was the 1980s, going into the 90s, into the early 2000s, and then in the 2000s, the board unanimously approved another evolutionary move after many years of recognizing that what the Surdna Foundation was really doing, emphasizing themes like equity, sustainability, inclusive economies, it was really social justice that they were talking about. And so the board unanimously approved changing the mission to be about social justice. And this was about a decade ago or so. And then, as I said earlier, about 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, the Surdna board decided that in order to achieve social justice in the US, we really have to center racial equity in that mission. So again, lots of change. I'm going to highlight just some things that we've learned along the way. And as you can imagine, it's not just change in terms of our external facing work, our grant-making guidelines and what we say to the public. A lot of this change really affected us internally in positive ways, really trying to think about how we, as an institution, can transform ourselves to reflect what we're trying to achieve externally. I'm going to begin this section by talking about, in the midst of all this change, one lesson that we learned was that having a core set of values and principles was critical, and sticking with those was critical. And so, it's a little bit ironic. You're talking about change, but at the same time, you're talking about staying the course. And so I'd like to cite 5 factors that have remained consistent for many decades at Surdna throughout all this evolution. So one is that the board and staff have always regarded Surdna as a risk taker and a first mover. This is something that you see in all the documents going back to the 1980s to now. This was something that the foundation believed well before the term, society's risk capital was attributed to philanthropy. And Certain was always taking bold steps to really invest in ideas and institutions from that early time. So that's one. A second one is something that Ed Skloot, the first president of the Certain Foundation, really emphasized, and that is we have an opportunity to really do a lot of work to advance the work that we're trying to advance beyond the money. So foundations should not only consider themselves to be grant-making institutions and to deploy monetary resources, but there's a tremendous amount that can be gained by going out into the field, giving talks, working with folks, being an honest broker, convening people. And so this is something the foundation really took seriously from a very early time. These days we tend to use the term high-touch grant-making, which has different connotations in different contexts, but the idea is the same. We're really just trying to be helpful in a more hands-on way and not in a top-down way, which I'll also get to in a moment. Third, we have really sought to practice humility and transparency. I mentioned that the Certain Foundation is not called the Andrus Foundation because John Andrus didn't want to see his name in lights. He believed very strongly that there should be modesty in the approach that the foundation would take. And so instead we have a funny name that I have to explain every time I talk about Cerna, but this has served us very well. And if you look at the way foundations are positioning themselves today, recognizing that there are power dynamics in this sector that can be harmful to advancing the work, this theme of humility, being open about our mistakes and our flaws and all the struggles that we're going through has been really beneficial in terms of learning in the sector. The fourth consistent theme that I like to cite is that we have tended, and this is Certain Foundation here, we have tended to embrace change and new realities, not so much because we've done exhaustive research on every possible contingency and all the issues, but because we developed enough of a rationale, justification for moving and being a first mover, and then really relying on the trust that we've built between board and staff, grantees, funding partners, and others to basically to figure it out as we go. And that may sound really risky and nervous-making for a lot of folks in philanthropy, but the fact is we have not held ourselves back because we don't know everything perfectly. We have really sought to try to move and then learn about it and be willing to admit to mistakes along the way and move forward at the speed of trust. This is a phrase that a lot of people use today, but it's something that we really take to heart. Can't move unless you really have developed a sense of trusting relationships. And the last really consistent theme that I want to cite was that we have always recognized the need to have a long-term commitment to root causes, addressing root causes of inequality or lack of sustainability in our communities. And that has led us to think about systems changes in policies and practices within the United States. These are practices and policies that produce disparate incomes, inequalities in our society. It is a tall order. It means that it requires us to take a longer-term stance. It also means that it comes with a recognition that systems change is hard and that philanthropy, fortunately, can play an important role in catalyzing that change. So those are some of the 5 really consistent themes, and I think that those consistent qualities have really enabled us to take on change, to embrace new realities, because we know who we are. So I'm going to get to the good part now and talk about the change. So the culture shift that we have really focused on, I'll talk about what's happened in the last decade. The shift to social justice, the more recent shift to really center racial equity, and I'll start with our grant making because that's a hugely important part of our culture and our operations and just the way we do our work. The Certain Foundation currently has 4 grant-making programs: Sustainable Environments, Inclusive Economies, Thriving Cultures, and the Andrus Family Fund, which focuses on empowering vulnerable youth. In addition, we've committed roughly 10% of our endowment to impact investing, and so that's a very important initiative. It's been around for about 3 years, or we launched it 3 years ago. And with the exception of our impact investing work, all of the other programs have been around for decades. Even though some of them had different titles, they've been around for decades. And so, as I mentioned earlier, when we made that shift to social justice and racial equity, we didn't exactly know precisely, perfectly know what we were getting ourselves into. But what we did know was that we had a shared vision for what we wanted to achieve. We knew that social justice was a value that we wanted to achieve. And one of the first things that we recognized we needed to do was to define our terms, have a shared understanding of what we meant by this North Star of ours. And so, and by the way, you can read about all these terms in our media kit, which is on the front page of our website. So we define social justice as the systemic, fair treatment of all people through the elimination of policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural narratives that reinforce differential outcomes. And often that means identifying and eliminating barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups in society. When we centered race in this work, we recognized that so many of those barriers and so many of those disparate outcomes are driven by racism, reflected in public policies, industry practices, cultural narratives, and so that is the rationale, that's how we defined it. That shared understanding enabled us to take it to the next level. If I were to identify one major change in our grant making, I can identify a lot more than one, but I'll just cite one example to begin with. I'd say that we have developed a much stronger recognition of the importance of power dynamics that drive agenda setting and also decision making. And if you think about power dynamics, who's got influence, who's got authority, who's got power, this is enormously important. If you're trying to achieve systems change on behalf of vulnerable people, people of color, low-income folks, historically and to this day, racism has been baked into a lot of our policies over our history, and we're still living with that legacy today. We have similar power dynamics established in a lot of other countries. When I was at the Ford Foundation, I got to see this firsthand. And a lot of those power dynamics are determined by not only race, but ethnicity, gender, religion, you name it. And so being able to address those systematically is absolutely critical. And so focusing on ensuring that communities have a voice, can exercise that power and influence has been a major change for us. And it's really driven a lot of positive change for us as well. And the way in which communities use power is enormously important. We've recognized that it's not sufficient to simply enable communities or organizations to win victories, short-term victories. Those are terribly important, but they're not sufficient in the long run because for example, if you achieve a policy change, you have to make sure that the implementation takes place. You have to ensure that the attitudes that may have prevailed previously have changed. And so we tend to be equally focused on long-term transformation in addition to those short-term battles, and that has led us to really prioritize long-term capacity building in the work that we do of organizations, of networks, and in communities. And that's something that is different from how we've thought about our role. And then another major factor is that we have really sought to change those power dynamics a little bit, to recognize how those dynamics affect the field, and to try to come up with better ways to really make sure that the field can advance in more positive ways. And one example I'll cite is in our evaluation work. If you think about evaluation that foundations do, a lot of it is very top-down, generally involving foundations that come up with metrics and indicators that are important to them, and then the grantees have to report on whether or not they achieve those outcomes and whether they're seeing those metrics. What we've tried to do is to really have a participatory approach to evaluation in which we have asked our grantees, we have asked our funding partners, people in communities, to give us a sense of what's important to them. what are the indicators, metrics that are really important, that really indicate to them that they're making progress. And we've incorporated those into our learning efforts. So we think we can make a contribution back to the field. So I'm going to shift a little bit because that has been largely the change that we have achieved in our external work. The culture shift has also really affected us internally because we recognize that, back in the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, when we were focused on social change is very external. As a social justice foundation, and now one that really focuses on racial justice, we recognize that it's terribly important to incorporate those values into our organization so that we're walking the talk. And this has been, a decade-long effort to try to do that. And the thing that is really wonderful is that we've been on this journey. We've been very intentional. We've built trust among board staff and partners. We started by hiring more people of color on the staff, again, about a decade ago, recognizing that the Andrus family, the broader network, it's about 500 people who are, alive and well and all eligible to be on the Certain board. They all have to apply. But among the family, it's an overwhelmingly white family, and so our board is 75% white folks. We have some external non-family members on the board, and two of them are people of color. And then on the staff, we have 75% people of color, including the leadership team. And so there's a pretty substantial difference there, but we're making it work. And again, we're doing that because we have really tried to incorporate these values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and at the same time, we've realized that DEI is not sufficient. We really have to focus on transformation and creating a culture that is supportive and inclusive, not just checking the box and making sure that our numbers look good. And I'll just cite a couple more things as I wrap up my remarks here. One is that, as we make this change internally, the culture shift, I often ask myself, what does this all add up to? What's the significance here? And one of the goals that I have is to, I would say the top goal that I have as the relatively new president is to make sure that we make good on the goals that we've announced to the public, the goals that we've established for ourselves, and that is we want to be a leading family foundation that focuses on racial justice in the United States, and we want to demonstrate that a family foundation, overwhelmingly white family members, can really make a difference, can have great positive impact in that regard. So we don't know whether or not we're going to have that impact because we've just launched this part of the journey in late 2018. But once we start to collect data and we start to learn about what our grantees are experiencing, we'll have more to report on. And that's something that I'm terribly excited about. A second thing in terms of my goals is that we have a recognition that we can't do it alone. And so I and others at the foundation really want to prioritize partnerships with community groups, with businesses, with governments, with other stakeholders that are critical to our success. And that is something that I am really prioritizing as I play my role as the president of the foundation. And then last, there are a few high-level aspirations that I have in terms of, indicators of whether or not we're really having that impact. And by ensuring voice among people of color, communities of color, one of the things I'm really prioritizing is ensuring that we see greater democratic participation from communities of color, marginalized communities, low-income communities. There was a recent op-ed by Tim Wu, who's a professor at Columbia University. He's the guy who coined the phrase net neutrality. His op-ed was about the oppression of the supermajority. And that really struck a note with me. It struck a chord because I recognize, and I think a lot of other Americans recognize, that we live in a society where there are supermajorities supporting things like climate action, like greater equitable opportunities, like better health care and all those types of things. And yet these are priorities. These are issues that have not been made good on. we don't see policy change moving in this direction. And that's something that I think is a result of a flawed economic system, a flawed democratic system, a democracy, and that is in need of reform. So that is a personal goal of mine. The last thing I'll talk about is just reflecting on this audience, on all of you. How can Better Business Bureau members lead on these issues? Well, first of all, I hope I've left you with some important lessons, some useful stories. The one thing I really want to reflect on is the fact that John Andrus, 100 years ago, thought that the way to make a difference, to reflect his faith, his values, his interest in addressing poverty, was to create orphanages to focus on young people. And if we think about young people today, 2020 is the year in which, for the first time ever, the percentage of white kids and kids of color is 50-50. We're at an inflection point. And if we're not addressing the imperative of racial equity, inclusion, opportunity, and really trying to focus on social justice as a sector, as a country, we're really sowing the seeds for a lot of bad stuff down the road. And so we talk a good game about future generations, about young people, but how are we transforming ourselves and our institutions to really address those challenges? And that's a new reality that I think we need to grapple with. And I recognize that all of us have the power to transform our institutions. We even collectively have the power to transform our sector. I hope you all will join us in that journey. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. And now I would like to bring up Christina Balboa, who is the director of Baruch Center for Nonprofit Strategy and Management, and she's going to moderate the question and answer session with Mr. Chen.
Well, thank you for such an inspiring story, and we could talk about this all day. We've got a lot of good questions from the audience. And one of the things, just to kick off, that I'm interested in is, you talked about culture change, and your organization has worked a lot with other organizations to foster this. And I'm wondering if you could also talk about how that might necessitate some structural changes within philanthropy and within nonprofits, and what examples might you have seen that are successes with that?
Sure. Yeah, I think structural changes within philanthropy, thus far I'm seeing a lot more changes within institutions. So individual institutions are starting to really shift their culture, shift their outlook on the power dynamics and also on the cultural imperatives that I cited. The example that I cited about evaluation, there are a lot of different names for more participatory approaches to evaluation. One is something called equitable evaluation, and if any of you have a subscription to the Chronicle of Philanthropy, there was a great letter to the editor about this recently that you should all read. But you know, I see foundations like the Annie Casey Foundation, Kresge, MacArthur, Serdna, really trying to embrace the principles of more equitable evaluation and moving things forward. Within the sector, I think the promising sign is that, and this is often cited as a trend in the last decade in philanthropy, there's a lot more effort to try to have collective pooling of resources, collective action, shared tables where foundations get together and try to do things together because even though we're $1 billion, other foundations have billions. One foundation can't do it alone unless you're really focused on a delimited place or subject. We are far more effective if we do things together. And so from that standpoint, I would say I see some promising signs in terms of structural change or at least culture change within the sector. And then the real structural change may occur if we see policy reform in the philanthropic sector itself. And so, we have the chief here who talked about New York State. There's been a lot of talk about public policy regarding foundations, and I'm sure many of you have read the commentary, how foundations, the philanthropic institutions are plutocratic structures and whatnot. That is something that, it'll be fascinating to see if that goes anywhere. But I think the fact that we're having these conversations in the public square is really wonderful. It's really important.
So a tough question from the audience on these examples of changes within the sector. Does the CERDNA, does capacity building at CERDNA translate into providing unrestricted support? And are you working with other foundations in the community to advocate for unrestricted support for nonprofits?
Yes, that's not a tough question at all.
Okay,
So,
great.
so I and my colleagues have long really prioritized unrestricted funding, general support. I'm even trying to get the foundation, and I'm pretty sure this will not meet with any resistance, to make much longer term grants. And this is something that I really benefited from as a grantee, and I suffered when it wasn't that way. And so unrestricted long-term general support is absolutely critical, and I think we recognize that's terribly important, so that the grantees aren't spending all their time, filling out forms and chasing after dollars.
Great.
Yeah.
And so, building on that, the long-term support, one of the questions that I have is about this idea of being a risk taker, and with risk comes failure, right? And so can you give some examples about learning from that failure, either through your grantees or within the organization itself, within the foundation itself?
Yeah, I definitely can. Some foundations have contests, like Ford and others, where they give an award for worst grant ever, and it's kind of, we don't actually have a contest at CERDNA, but we're pretty earnest and open about sharing some of the lessons from grants that didn't go the way we were expecting, and so I think that's a very healthy practice. I'll cite one example from my time as both a grantee and a grantor. I was the executive director of Smart Growth America, which is a policy shop in DC focused on reforming the way urban policy affects our communities. So it's really urban growth and development. We really focused on trying to ensure that there was less sprawl development, destroying farmland and natural areas, and at the same time more reinvestment in cities, more affordable housing, more investment in infrastructure. And one of the things that I would say from that whole sector and that experience in my career that we did not anticipate was just what would happen when you have a lot of reinvestment in cities, and really not thinking through the calculus of who owns what. Who controls what? And this comes down to the power question again. If you look at the last several decades in which I've been in this field, we had a long period of disinvestment in cities for decades, where the big concern was how do we get investment back into cities. Now that we have investment back into cities, we see patterns of inequality, destructive practices in terms of our environment, really replicating themselves just in a different physical form. And so that's something that I think we didn't anticipate. CERDNA was a very significant funder in that area, and I think our grant makers at the time weren't totally anticipating that either. So that's one thing. I'll probably write a long essay about that someday.
You should.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
There's a lot to learn from that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we have a lot of questions here, and I'm trying to sort through thematically how they work. But let me just ask, so how do you measure or monitor democratic participation in your inclusion work?
Mm-hmm. So there are a number of different ways, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because there are 3 organizational goals that came out of our latest strategic planning process. One is democratic participation, another is wealth building, and the third one is accountability. And accountability tends to refer to public accountability and also accountability of private institutions, of corporations, and it really should apply to us as well as philanthropy. And so, that's something that we take very seriously. So, with regard to democratic participation, what we have tried to do is to really think about all of our work, whether it's arts and culture work, economic work, other areas of work, with this underlying value of participation in our democratic institutions, in voting, in running for elective office, and public service and other types of things. And so that's something that we've really baked in. One thing one of the things that we funded years ago is the Boards and Commissions Leadership Institute. We funded Local Progress, a number of other entities that really try to make sure that people from communities can run for office and not only run and get elected, but be successful as folks who govern. And so these are programs that tend to provide technical support, mentoring, and other resources so that folks who do get on city commissions or become mayor or member of Congress or president really have the backing, the knowledge to read a public budget and to do other things. So that's one way in which we've done it externally. Internally, we've really sought, as I cited a couple examples of how do we bring the grantees' thinking into our work? How do we really try to, as much as possible, because I don't want to pretend that we have any false humility. I mean, there is a power dynamic. There always will be a power dynamic in philanthropy. But how can we acknowledge it candidly and then also try to dismantle it to the degree that we can by really respecting what people in communities and in grantee organizations have to say. And that's just a constant gardening, if you will. We have to constantly be focused on that.
And it seems like shifting the evaluation standards of that the grantees aspire to the grantees' responsibility does a lot to change that power dynamic.
It does, yeah.
Or we'll see.
That's
how
the
it does.
idea.
Yeah.
That's the theory behind it.
Right.
We'll see if it works.
So that's one example. I'm wondering, another question from the audience, what actions or activities of your grantees, so this is looking externally, has your foundation found that really changes systems? I'm not certain if this was internally within the organizations or within the communities that those organizations are trying to impact.
Within the community.
Within the community. So.
Really changes systems. I think there are a number of things. I mean, one example that I'll cite is I think foundations have a really great opportunity to support alternatives, alternative models for doing things, and in our case, doing it in a socially just way. And an example that I like is the Neighborhoods First Fund here in New York City. I think many of you know that during the Bloomberg administration, there was a push for upzoning and for densification of development, which, on principle, sounds like a wonderful idea, and it's something that I've been focused on in my career. At the same time, it was really important for neighborhood residents to have a say and to be able to imagine what the future of their community could be. And so the Neighborhoods First Fund was really an effort to try to come up with a different way of that community outreach that we often see in cities like New York. Not just have like a presentation from somebody from the city, department of XYZ, but to really have like a charrette, a process by which community leaders and just residents get together and imagine what they would like their community to become, with some civic goals in mind, but have that be informed by the public. And so that's something that CERDNA has invested heavily in, and one of our staff people is the co-chair. And I think it's great as a model for how you can develop a different system for how that's done.
Yeah, that's great. So we have a question to you. As a prominent Asian American man in this sector, what are some thoughts that you can share regarding Asians in philanthropy and education and the role of Asians in civic engagement in general?
Yeah, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, so thank you whoever asked that question. I appreciate that. And I'll just cite that one of my major goals as a relatively new foundation president, and one of very, very few CEOs who are Asian American in this AAPI in this field, I'm very focused on really trying to support and lead an effort among AAPI people, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, to really have a voice in the sector. And one of the things that I've observed is that there are some institutions that are focused on that. I think the public and people in the sector really need to know what we stand for. And if you think about, AAPIs in America, we're not monolithic. There are many, many cultures and languages, and you name it. It's like super diverse. It's like as diverse, or even more so than Europe. But there are some common themes, some common priorities among AAPI people. One is we care about immigration. We care about inclusion. We care about language access. We care about the census. There are a lot of things that are priorities, whether you're, a conservative or a liberal. These are all issues that, are resoundingly important to the AAPI community, and that's something that I want to devote a lot of my energy towards, as a way to contribute not only to AAPIs and our communities in the United States, but also to the sector.
Great.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more second. No,
No?
we don't have
Okay,
any more
we're
time.
done.
Oh, darn, I had a good one for the last question,
Okay.
but I will ask you later.
All right, great.
Great. Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much for your time.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for your questions.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Don Chen. Thank you, Christine Balboa. That was wonderful.